What I'm going to read from today is a novella called The King of Next Week. This is a historical fantasy novella as by E.C. Ambrose, and it recently came out from Guardbridge Books. So Sarah and I were actually supposed to have a local event together last weekend at my local indie bookstore, where we were going to talk about the joys of doing historical research, and especially since we both are writing on the high seas for our most recent releases. So we were bemoaning the fact that that event had to be canceled, and that is part of what brings me here today. So again, it's The King of Next Week by E.C. Ambrose, and I'm just going to begin at the beginning. Chapter 1, June 1866. Rain and wind lashed the schooner Diana as she heeled into the gale. Waves crashed against the hull, but these waves felt different, a subtle change that resonated through the deck and the lines. Land was near, deflecting the water. With a surge of excitement, Captain Matthew Percy leaned far out from the rail, right hand clenched to the netting, left hand clasping his Union cap to his head. A safety line dug into his waist, the other end pegged near the bowsprit, as Diana heaved upward over a wave and crashed down again on the other side, adding a needless shower of ocean to the soaking he had already earned. Lightning snapped through the sky. His skin tingled, the hairs on his arms standing. For a moment, Matt held his breath, suspended between the bucking ship and the lightning's veil of fire. In that flare of brilliant light, he saw the island that shouldn't be there. "Land ho! Hard a starboard! Ready all hands!" he shouted, his voice already hoarse. Again, the ship heaved beneath him, and he absorbed the impact with bent knees. "There is no land anywhere, Captain," the purser, John Crowley, hollered back. The pitching sea tossed Crowley against the rail like a soldier caught by a cannon's blast. "You've seen the chart." "Oh, there's land," muttered Tahari, the pilot they'd picked up at Tenerife. He crouched at the rail near Matt's feet, staring outward, oblivious to the rain. Demon-haunted land, spirits to drive you mad. "He's already mad," Crowley shouted. Matt turned about, riding the tossing ship as if she were a wild mare and he were determined to tame her. "Will, hard a starboard, ready with the sea anchor." "Aye, Captain." His first mate's voice boomed through the rain. His grin flashed like lightning across his dark face. "Crowley, back to work." Crowley glared, but he obeyed, pulling himself along the lines back to the waiting crew. Crowley objected to the cargo, to the season, but most of all, to serving under a Negro mate. Matt had half a mind to bind the purser to the sea anchor and chuck him overboard. But Crowley was Lee's man, and besides, he needed all the hands if he would harness the gale. If they could get to leeward of the island, it might offer some shelter at least. If not, they'd be halfway around the Horn before they could get their bearings. On the other hand, he heard the Indies had a strong market for ice. When the swells rose, Matt caught another glimpse of that land, closer now, a twin-peaked rise maybe as long as the whole of Phippsburg, Maine. The wind rushed them on, and he clung to his cap all the more. Stupid to be wearing out on a day like this, but the damn thing had brought him through the war. Pray God it carried him through this storm. Rain lashed down his neck, red hair curling limp against his cheeks, but he dare not spare his grip to push it back. "Should be me up there," Tahari said. "And you'd guide us to the Demon Isle? I don't think so." The point of land rushed toward them in a series of flashes, though none so powerful as the one that had dazzled him a few moments ago. With each stroke of lightning, Matt expected to hear the crack of a mast, but the jagged strokes struck upon the island's peak, making him wonder if Tahari might have the right of it. Demon-haunted. Matt had demons to spare, thanks to the war. They did not scare him anymore. Besides, who had more need of ice than a people who lived, so it was said, in fire? Over his shoulder, Matt called, "Ready!" "Aye," Will roared back. With each flash, Matt counted. Thunder rolled across the sky overhead. Another flash. There. "Now!" He swept the hat from his head and waved his arm. "Will, do it now!" "Heave, heave!" Will ran down the deck and back again, an extra set of hands as the crew lifted the wood and sailcloth sea anchor and hurled it over the rail. The rope groaned against the capstan. Matt held his breath, praying it would hold. Then, with the sharp grace that defined her, the ship swung about, her bow aimed along the island's sheltered side. A ridge of stones rose up like those formidable clouds that heralded the storm. Then the mountain sheared into the wind, cliffs towering too close. Diana swept alongside the stone, blessedly slowing. The storm still battered him, but the wind died to a frustrated howl. He had dared the storm and won. His shoulder aching with remembered pain, Matt unbent his fingers, not releasing his grip, but stretching out his hand, his muscles throbbing. How long had he been hanging on? He allowed himself a long breath as his men, his ship, his cargo slipped behind the island to safety. Again, the water changed beneath him. Then Diana shuddered to a halt with the gritty sound of a sandbar deep below. Thrown off balance, Matt snatched for the netting, but his numb fingers failed him, and he tumbled from the rail into the sea. Water sucked him down as he plunged toward the sand. By the distant flash of lightning, he saw a wash of gleaming red in the sand beneath him. Crimson glass, apparently swept from the shores above and hoarded by the waves. He struck the sand and his breath rushed into darkness. A woman gazed down on him, her face glowing faintly, leaving a ripple in the air as she moved her head, an after-image, as if he had gazed too long at the sun. Her skin looked by turns darker than teak or mahogany, then swirled with ruby, reminding him of blown glass, still moving in a smoky furnace. Her eyes flickered like a forge's light, her gaze arrested by something near his head, and her lips parted in a breath of wonder. His heart fell, wishing that it were his face that captured her, but still, she smiled, and that was enough. "What are you dreaming?" Will's voice. Matt kept his eyes closed, heat pouring down on him from that distant beauty. Very well, it was the sun that warmed him, not some glowing maiden with long dark hair and flaming eyes. His head and arm throbbed, then a soothing cold settled against his skin, hands pressing the hard chill to his shoulder. Ice to cool his fever. "Ooh, that's good. Thank you, Nurse Barton." Will's laughter echoed around him. Somewhere close by, waves tumbled, and the water stroked a gentle shore. "You're not in Morris Island Hospital, Captain, and I'm no Clara Barton." "More's the pity." Matt cracked open one eye. "I'm not dead, then." "Not this time." Will sat back with a wince of his own, rubbing his spine. He had a long face, deep-set eyes, and dense curly hair no wind could ruffle. Overhead, a makeshift structure of planks, branches, and foreign leaves kept the sun from burning Matt a shade to match his own hair. His mouth and nostrils stung with salt. "You reeled me in? Like a codfish and twice as floppy. You ever thought about being short?" Will held his hand palm down, as if he could press Matt into a more compact form. "Sure, I thought of it. Then I thought, when I get back to Phippsburg, old man Lee's going to cut me down to size." He moved to sit up, and pain swept from his right shoulder, so he sagged back again to the blanket-covered sand. "I keep hoping he'll give up on that." Will moved to sit beside Matt in the shade. He mopped sweat from his brow with a square of gingham, so worn that the red checks were a uniform pale gold. "Don't count on it." They shared a look that finished the conversation. "If you hadn't insisted on bringing me and those other Negroes," Will would say, "your folk would be perfectly happy to have you around." "If we would have both died with Colonel Shaw, I wouldn't have felt the need," Matt would reply. After the 54th led the charge on Fort Wagner, Matt found Will still alive in the press of the dead and dying. Before the assault, the rebels vowed to bury the white officers and the Negro soldiers together in a common grave. And, with the Union retreat, everyone knew the rebels would bloody well make good on their oath. Will and Matt had limped out of that nightmare together. They wouldn't have made it as far as the field hospital without each other, and Matt was not about to let go now. "What's our disposition?" Will straightened up and squared his shoulders to something like military bearing in spite of his torn uniform and weary features. "Good and stuck, sir. Work's begun on repairing the topsails and fitting the new rear mast, the one that had gone down in the first violent assault of the storm as they rushed to reef the sails. Some minor repairs, 3 crewmen injured, Parker with a broken leg, McCobb caught a splinter as long as your arm, and yourself a knock to the head and popped your shoulder. The usual, the damned injury that wouldn't let him be." Matt traced the sling on his right arm with his left hand, then followed it up to where a lump of ice wrapped in cloth sat cooling the ache. "You popped it back?" "Wasn't so easy this time." Will gazed out toward the ship. "Crowley's got a bad case of the grumbles, and Tahari's been in the aft cabin since we beached, muttering about demons." "We've already got one. Crowley. Who's the idiot who brought him on board?" "That'd be you, sir." "Did you just call your captain an idiot?" "No, sir. I just don't like to contradict my commander." Will grinned. "Shut up." The entire crew, top to bottom, comprised the most motley assembly of sailors in all of Maine, the only ones willing to sign on to Matt's dream. In spite of Frederick Tudor's success down in Massachusetts a few years back, many sailors still held that a cargo of ice would melt en route, sinking the boat from the inside out. Aside from Lee, every shipyard in Phippsburg turned him down, all the faster when he explained his plan to have a mostly Negro crew to ship to the African coast. Matt held the bundle of ice to his shoulder and pushed towards sitting. Will caught him about the shoulders and got him steady. Diana sat upright across a sandbar at the base of a stream that ran down from the forested slope behind. The three-masted schooner with her high prow and smooth lines remained the most beautiful ship he'd ever seen. Lee was a bastard, but he had some fine shipwrights. Aside from the upper mast, she looked awfully good for what she'd been through. 3 injuries in a gale, and one of those was the same injury over again. Well, he could hardly count that. Good and stuck, you said. Look at her keel, how deep she's mired. Even the tide didn't lift her. I don't know how we'll get her afloat again, except... Will shrugged. He rubbed his bit of gingham between his fingers. Except we unload the cargo. How much of it? They looked at the ship together, shallow water lapping her planks, while the crew worked on the deck or on the shingle nearby. Matt needed no reply. He could see the answer just by looking at her. Too much. Let's hope the demons need ice. Beg your pardon? Will reached over and gently prodded Matt's temple. Yep, knocked on the head, sure enough. I'm surprised that hard skull of yours didn't knock right through the hull and sink us yourself. I'm a madman. You knew that before you ever came to Phippsburg. Will nodded. Me, I'm resting up and making nice with the nurses. You're playing with your ice pack and dreaming of cold cash. Everybody flirts with nurses, Will, but they marry the rich ones. Where's Tahari? Tell him to get the demons out here. Dreamer, Will snorted. You've always been the king of next week. I dreamed us this far, didn't I? Will took a leisurely look around, from the endless sea before them to the grounded ship and the restless crew. Oh yeah, you sure did. So that's how the story begins. That was The King of Next Week. It's a historical fantasy novel, novella, I should say. It began when I was visiting Phippsburg, Maine, and started learning more about the maritime history of the area. As you probably know, some of you are aware, I'm sort of a research junkie, so that's half the fun of writing a new project, is how much I can read and discover before I delve into the actual plotting and characters.
Was it one of the first ice shipments out or something?
This is a few years after Frederick Tudor started, as I said, down in Massachusetts, but everybody regarded it as kind of a crazy venture. And when I first learned about it, I thought, yeah, that is crazy. Imagine people spending the winter harvesting ice from ponds in New England and then packing it with straw and shipping it all the way to India, you know, so that the people of the British Raj could have ice in their drinks.
You know, the Romans imported ice from the mountains for the well-to-do to have a kind of ice cream dessert.
Yeah.
So it's
and
kind of
I'm
funny
talking about 2,000 years ago.
You know, right. It was this prestige item, basically, that you could have ice anytime you wanted it. It's interesting to think doing, you know, the event that we were supposed to do that was canceled. And of course, Sarah had her ship get a little involved with ice, but in a different way.
And I was thinking when I was reading this book about that wonderful scene in the beginning of 100 Years of Solitude, in which they go to see ice. And it's the most magical thing anyone has ever seen. Were the black crews historical as well?
There were certainly black sailors, especially in this area. Later on in the story, we will learn about an area called Malaga Island, which is just off the coast of Phippsburg and was settled by principally by free blacks, many of whom were sailors and fishermen locally. So they would have been involved with the shipping industry.
Did you know all this about types of ships and how to take care of them in a gale and all that kind of stuff? Or did you have to research all that?
I knew a few things just because, you know, my family's been involved with sailing from way back, and I have an interest in tall ships. So I've been casually reading up on them or learning more about them over a period of years. But yeah, to invest in the moment and sort of in the scene took some more research. Visits to the Maritime Museum up there, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, we live in the next town over from Phippsburg, and we've heard enough
really?
about Malaga Island to throw up.
Yeah, it's that was a very disturbing, interesting part of the history. Because what happens later on, for those who are not local and haven't done a lot of reading on this, is when the governor comes up with the slogan Maine Vacation Land, there was a big push, and this was around the early 1900s. There's a big push to sort of make the coastal Maine seem very appealing to the wealthy people and folks who could come up from the Boston area to vacation in Maine. And Malaga was sort of between Phippsburg and the neighboring peninsula, and both of them were pointing fingers at the other and saying, "Oh no, this is your land. You need to clean it up because we want things to look nice." And what they meant by looking nice was clearing out the settlers who were living there. So it was one of the most horrific racist incidents that I have read about, certainly in my research, unexpectedly in Maine, which we think of as being, a little further north, not that involved in slavery. And yet it turns out that a lot of the shipping interests were also deeply involved with shipping things like cotton for the South.
Yeah.
So the history gets real complicated real fast. And what they ended up doing was basically expelling all of the people who lived on Malaga Island. The children, many of whom were mixed race, were considered to be mentally inferior. Some of them were taken to institutions, including the historical Will Johnson's daughter that we know of. So all of the cabins
Basically shipped to the Maine home for the feeble-minded, even though they were adults and perfectly rational.
Right.
Yeah.
We have no reason to believe they were anything but ordinary folks trying to scratch out a living, on some marginal land. Yeah. Yeah, I've been having some mixed feelings about whether I should reach out to the Phippsburg Historical Society, which was kind enough to host me for some of my research while I was up there, and say, "Hey, I've written the thing. This is a part of the history that's a little bit touchy." Obviously, they're very excited about their shipping history and all of the shipyards and things like that. But Malaga, from what I can tell, is still a little bit of a prickly subject.
Well, there's been a lot of historical work or archaeological work done on it recently. So there is a sympathetic cast of mind with the Phippsburg Historical Society, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
I knew somebody who was involved in the discussion and discovery of Black history in Portsmouth, and she thought that there would be people with burning torches outside her house, and reality was very different. She was welcomed, her work was welcomed, and now there's a really lovely couple of memorials to Black history in Portsmouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was up in Phippsburg the second time we went, we had brought our kayaks up, so we actually paddled out to Malaga from the restaurant, and I don't remember the name of the restaurant. There's not very many in Phippsburg, but there's a restaurant sort of right there by the boat launch, which is excellent and highly recommended, and fully decked out with all kinds of model ships, which are really fantastic to see. But they have a very nice sign up about the history of the island, which was great to see. And then when we paddled out there, there's sort of a bit of an interpretive trail with some signage pointing out cellar holes and wells and things actually on the island, the remnants of that civilization.
Yeah.
Well, my dad's over here in this other box. My grandfather had a sailboat in Seattle for many years and finally had to give up sailing and move on to a tugboat. So when I was 10, 11 or so, we took a sail up through past the San Juan Islands up to Vancouver Island, Canada. So we spent several nights on the boat as we were going up. You know, we got to see the sails and hang out and throw a crab pot overboard and such. And that was certainly a formative experience of my younger years, to be able to share that experience of being on the sea. I was a little bit envious because just a couple of years ago, my dad took my son on an intergenerational cruise on a schooner called the Adventurous, which was sailing from, it wasn't in Seattle, but it's close to there.
Anacortes, I think, is the town
Anacortes.
it's off from.
That's where they send off a lot of the whale watches and things.
That's
So-
where the ferries leave for.
Right. I actually took one of the ferries out myself to look for orcas, which was fantastic. And I got to see the Adventurous when she was out, you know, sort of tooling around the islands as she was doing. So that was pretty neat.
I asked because I'm a sailor, seriously.
Oh, okay.
So I was intrigued by your description of sailing in conditions quite different than the ones I normally have. I go out 2-3 days a week. I
Oh,
sail
wow.
a lot.
What kind of boat?
These days, a 38-foot Beneteau.
All right, that's nice. Seaworthy.
I'll
I
be
take
out
it?
tomorrow. I'm sorry?
Seaworthy, I take it. You
I
get out in the
hope
ocean?
so.
So far, so good.
You know, we take really good care of her. She's in very good shape. There's some deferred maintenance thanks to the virus, but it's minor things like the music system stopped working, and radar, which I really only need in fog or at night, isn't working right now. And it's probably a minor electrical problem in both cases, but I can't get anyone. The marina is open, but the pier is closed and we can't bring any repair guys on board, unfortunately.
Where are you in California?
San Francisco.
Okay.
But we saw a whale in the bay last week.
Oh.
It came up several times around our boat, so I don't even have to go out looking for orcas.
They come to you.
Gray whales and sometimes humpbacks come into the bay in fairly good numbers this time of year. There are probably 20 to 40 whales a day who come in either to the outer bay or all the way into the main part of the bay.
Wow.
Doesn't mean we can see them, but they're there.
Right.
They say if you see one, there's maybe 12 more that you're not seeing.
So a few years ago, they started coming back into the bay. No one's quite sure what changed. When I first moved to San Francisco, if a whale made it in the bay, it was lost or injured or sick. And it was a big event, and the Coast Guard and everybody had run out to try and herd it back out to sea. But about 3 or 4 years ago, the marine biologists started seeing large numbers of whales coming in to the outer bay, which is the area west of the Golden Gate Bridge, and then past the Golden Gate Bridge all the way into the main part of the bay. And I've seen one as far south as the Bay Bridge, if you know the geography of the bay at all. But that's like 10 miles in.
Well,
Wow. Elaine, do you have the physical book that you can hold up?
I don't have it yet. It's on the way. Originally, the idea was to produce the ebooks and the print books at the same time, because I had a series of in-person events where I was hoping to be able to, hold up the book, do readings and signings and things. And then obviously everything went topsy-turvy. So I think the print books are now available online through various ordering systems. The ebook was released about 2 weeks ago. So, and I don't actually have my copies yet.
Elaine, what's the title? I came in late.
The title is The King of Next Week,
The King of Next Week.
and it's actually, I'm going to tweak up my name here because it's under a pseudonym. So
Yeah.
E.C. Ambrose is my historical fantasy pseudonym.
I just looked you up online and see there are a bunch of books
There are a
Yeah.
bunch of books.
under
There
that
are quite a
name.
few books,
How did you
And-
choose them?
and they're very good. Elaine, or EC, I should say, send me a copy of the cover art and I'll put it in with the video.
Yeah, that would be great. We should have talked about that, but things have been scattered, as you all
Things have
know.
been scattered.
Yes.
Scattered to the four winds or beyond.
Elaine, how did you choose your pseudonym? What's the significance of Ambrose? Was it related to Ambrose Bierce or?
It's actually Ambrose Perret. So the pseudonym originally came about when I was marketing a book called Elisha Barber, which became the first of a 5-volume series called The Dark Apostle. And I wanted a pseudonym. I knew the books were coming out in hardcover, so here's the marketing mindset. Thanks, Dad. You put on your marketing cap and you think, what am I going to do to make this book get the kind of positioning that you'd like? So when people are browsing hardcover books, they're typically shelved separately from mass markets. And often there'll be sort of a new books shelf. So if you picture yourself going to the bookstore and browsing, you begin at A and you proceed from there. So it's advantageous to have a pseudonym that begins with one of the first 3 letters of the alphabet, because then you're going to be higher up, you're going to be just about at eye level. And one of the inspirations, for the Dark Apostle series was a 15th century barber surgeon in France named Ambrose Perret. And he had a reputation as sort of a humanist. He tried to be as merciful as possible when treating his patients, which wasn't always the hallmark of medicine at the time. He was very humble, and he left us several books about how he did his work, as well as sort of his memoirs. So it was great to have closer to primary sources. The book I ended up writing was set in the 14th century rather than 15th century, but he was definitely one of the inspirations. So when I was casting about for what I would use as a pseudonym, Ambrose made a lot of sense to sort of pay homage to one of my inspirations.
Because we used to have a cat of that name, which is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, it was a black cat, and we got him from a rural animal shelter, and as a black cat, he came with the name of Bro. And on one hand, kind of wanted to keep that, but we needed to fix it. So we renamed him Ambrose after Ambrose Bierce.
Also an excellent choice.
But of course, then he proceeded to disappear a number of times. And it was like, oh God, never name a cat after Ambrose Bierce.
Well, it could be worse. I
That's
had a cat named Odin for a long time, and when I got him, he had 2 eyes.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
But you see this coming, right? One of his
Yeah.
eyes started to go dark, started to change, and the vet said it could be cancer, but we really can't biopsy an eye. So our best bet is to remove the eye before it can spread. And so, yeah, I ended up with a one-eyed cat named Odin, which of course made perfect sense to everybody. Although I felt a little guilty about it and a little, is there magic in my history that I don't know about?
That's a writer thing. Blame yourself.
Always looking for the narrative.
When I did a book about the Great Paris Flood, there were 2 floods in Boston. It was my fault.
It's good of you to own up to it.
Okay, I think we can start being official now and just.
Book in my international thriller series. The book that my dad was holding up earlier, Bone Guard 1, is the first volume, The Mongol's Coffin. And second volume, The Nazi Skull, came out last year. So the new one is called The Assassin's Throne. And interesting story. So I do too much research for my books, which I had mentioned earlier. And the concept for the Mongol's Coffin arose out of the fact that I was doing a deep dive into Mongolian history for a historical fantasy project called Drake Master, which doesn't have a publication date yet, but someday, it will. And I thought that I'm doing a lot of reading on this, and it's really interesting material, and it would be fun if I could take the same research that I'm using to create a fantasy world and spin it out and make an entirely different kind of book out of it, and then sort of get a twofer. So I ended up with a thriller novel about former special ops intelligence agents who basically establish a private security firm for archaeological and cultural remains. So the Mongol's Coffin is about the quest for Genghis Khan's throne. Then naturally, the second book that I decided to write, The Nazi Skull, is about the submarine POW camps for submarine sailors from Nazi Germany that were in Arizona during World War II, which I think is another one of those weird spots in history. You go, wait, Nazi submarine, Arizona, how does this happen? And of course, that was a lot of fun to research, but it had absolutely no overlap with any fantasy book so far.
Well, you can write something about a desert.
Maybe so. But yeah, so I have another novella that I'll be releasing. It's an indie release later on this year. Originally, my hope was to have some things out for ReaderCon, which is one of the highlights of my summer, but unfortunately, ReaderCon is also canceled.
It may go virtual, I heard.
So might go virtual. Is it worth getting a book out for virtual con? I am not sure. Yeah, so that project is the third in my Tales of Blades End series, which are basically epic fantasy novellas about what happens when the hero comes home. The heroes believe that their battle is over, that the war is won, and now they're dealing with the aftermath of that. So the first one was Winning the Gallows Field. The second one was Joanna's Axe, and the third book, which will be coming out later on this year, is called The Hearth Witch's Son. And those are as Elaine Isaac. So what's actually next? I'm currently researching for another historical novel project, which may stay straight historical and not fantastical at all. We'll see if I'm able to restrain myself. No promises.
What made you get into historical fiction?
Jean Cavellos at the Odyssey Workshop. She gave us an assignment to research the setting for one of the stories that we were working on. And I had a story that was quasi-Mongolian. It was a horse-based culture, but I kind of just threw it together. I was like, right, and they have lots of horses, and it's all about the horses. It's sort of inspired by my sister, who is all about the horses. So when Jean gave us this assignment during the workshop, I thought, well, it's a good opportunity to learn more about Mongolia. And I ended up reading a lot about Mongolia and falling in love with Mongolia, and then writing a couple of other short stories, getting the opportunity to go visit Mongolia many years ago now. I'd love to go back. It's a wonderful, wonderful visit. As you've heard, writing another book about Mongolia. So that's what turned me into a research junkie. And since then, I've been guided by doing very sort of general nonfiction reading. There's some magazines I subscribe to where sometimes I discover something cool and interesting, and I think, oh, I want to learn more about that. Often what happens is that I'm reading somebody's general history book or something about a period or a place, and I end up following the footnotes, and I go, oh, that sounds really interesting. So Drake Master, the historical fantasy novel set in China during the Mongol invasion, was largely inspired by a footnote in a book about the Antikythera mechanism, where the author just couldn't resist mentioning Joseph Needham's works on the science and civilization of China. And the author chose this phrase, the vermilion pens of the ladies secretarial. That's beautiful. I need to know more. And it turns out that the words were in reference to the astronomical clock developed by Su Sung around 1090 AD for the purpose of more accurately determining the astronomical charts, or astrological charts, I should say, of imperial children to see who was really a suitable follower, who would be the correct heir because their chart has the most favorable signs. So Su Sung develops this huge, extraordinary device that tracks the stars and the movements of heavenly bodies, translates all of that into very elaborate timekeeping devices. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And the notes were then meticulously taken by the ladies secretarial in their red ink to signify the imperial children. And then, of course, I had to write a book about that. So,
the vortex of footnotes
exactly.
and pictures of things.
I recently hit one of the milestones, I think, on the historical novelist bingo card, which is tracking down the author of an obscure academic text online, following that person, getting them to respond to my messages, and then asking them about a footnote. Hey, I really loved your book. By the way, this little thing, could you just maybe expand on that? Yeah. She hasn't replied to that message. I don't know why. Crazy American authors.
Was that author not an American?
She's Italian.
Oh.
So I think the book was a doctoral thesis. I had it right over here. Hang on.
During Throne of Solomon. Wow.
Oh, I would read that from the title alone.
Yeah, what an intriguing title.
So the Throne of Solomon is a fascinating artifact, and obviously, I'll have spoiler alert, what my most recent completed manuscript is about. But it's really obscure, and it shouldn't be. It deserves to be wider known. So I found out that this book existed, which of course is the seminal, the only work that is devoted to the Throne of Solomon. And I originally requested it through interlibrary loan. My librarian was able to get it for me. Usually my experience of dense academic texts is that I really aspire to read the whole thing, and I really can't actually do it. So I end up reading the sections that are most relevant. I end up sort of gold mining, looking for the bits that I'm really going to need, and wading through a lot of academic jargon. But this book is lively and delightful. It was very enjoyable. You can see I have lots of book darts on the pages to keep track of all the cool things that I found. So this project may in fact lead to another fantasy novel at some point, we'll see. But I was enjoying the book so much from the library that I thought I will bite the bullet and buy my own $100 copy of this book that is rather hard to come by. Totally worth it. But yeah, I think it was her doctoral thesis, which is why it's sort of limited release. And she is actually a teacher at a school in Italy. So, but she does have a Facebook presence. Aha!
So did she write is it a translation from Italian, or did she write in English?
No, she wrote it in English. There are occasional times when that is clear. There's a few phrases that she's not using quite right. It's like just a little bit off from how a native English speaker would say it. But generally speaking, very, very clear, very readable. And I love the fact that her footnotes are often the kinds of things that it's like, this isn't really related to my topic, but I came across it and it's really interesting.
Yeah, you get to do that in nonfiction where you can't quite do it in fiction. Here
I was
is my
reading my
wonderful
blog-
research lump. I will give it to you whether you answer it or not, and whether it fits in the book or not.
Yep. I suffered for
Footnote.
my research, and now so must you. But when I was doing my blog as E.C. Ambrose, I regarded it as the footnotes for that series, the Dark Apostle series about medieval surgery, because I found out all these cool things, and you couldn't put all that in the book, you know. So I would write a blog entry about it instead. And then when each book came out, I would sort of say, okay, here are the blog entries that are specific to things that happen in this book or characters that you'll encounter in situations that come up in the book. So you can sort of follow along with the footnotes if you wanted to.
Yeah, I did like actual footnotes for Chasing Shakespeare's and just put them up so people could read them, and did videos for Crimes and Survivors because there was such cool stuff, and I wanted to show people the pictures and, you know, have them take a ride on the subway in New York. So yes, there's that desire to give and give and give all of the background.
But wasn't this what hypertextuality was supposed to get us?
I know, yes. Somehow our enthusiasm is always a little bit greater than some other people's.
Well, I mean, a lot has had to do with publishers' idea of a book. I mean, okay, so there was okay, now we will do digital books and they will be as much like television as possible. And that failed. And so then it became, now we will do digital books and they will be as much like print books as possible. And so don't do any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think it's got more to do with that than any kind of rational thing.
Well, it's interesting, those of us who are doing things independently, that you can play around with the recipe and see what works and see what works for you.
Yeah.
One of the nonfiction books I'm reading right now is called Hamlet on the Holodeck, and it is about narrative in cyberspace. The book has been around for a few years. I don't remember how I learned about it, but it had been repeatedly recommended as a source for thinking about the effect of cyberspace on fiction, and how you can use cyberspace to tell stories, to tell different kinds of stories potentially, and to include maybe some more of that ancillary material. So I am building up toward potentially doing some game writing. So I wanted to immerse myself more in that world and sort of what goes on behind the game, behind the scenes.
Catherine and I both did hypertexts, and the trouble is that eventually you would reach the end, the edges of the game board. But the expectation was that it was an infinite narrative space.
Well, I think I kind of addressed that. I mean, mine just looped back on itself. And
Yeah. Well,
people would think there was some kind of underlying AI that made you, that knew what you'd read before. And it was, no, I just made obsessively many links because I was crazy.
I sort of did that too with King of Space because it was set in this smallish spaceship. There is always the problem of the edge of the page.
Yeah.
And the things,
well, I mean,
people tell you, and nothing happens.
Yeah, well, the thing about footnotes is they're like at the bottom of the page and you know where that edge is. So there's one more layer beyond the page, but there's not the expectation that it goes on and on and on.
That's very interesting, where you have a narrative space and another kind of narrative space. And Terry Pratchett does that all the time, of course. Also Nabokov.
Right.
Yeah. My mind goes to Terry Pratchett faster than it goes to Pale Fire.